Yes, we would like people to be nice to us because we're a minority and we do want to feel included, but what's the payback if you do that? Is it just, let's be nice to the gays, or let's be nice to the women, or let's be nice to the people of color? No, it's actually, it's very much a two-way street. It's a bargain. Basically, if you empower
Hello, and welcome to the Finding the Unicorn in You podcast. I'm Dr. Jaime G. Raygoza, a life coach, psychologist, and your host. Join me on a journey to inspire and transform ordinary lives into something special. Here, we celebrate the unicorns, those who choose not to follow the ordinary conventional path, but rather chase after their dreams and choose the path less taken, making them truly unique. Together, we'll explore powerful life coaching techniques and hear from special guests who embody the spirit of unicorns in their own way. What are we waiting for? Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Finding the Unicorn in You. Today, I have a unique individual who opened up his own DE&I consultancy practice, the Inclusion Imperative. He helps commercial organizations to build leadership abilities and harness the power of inclusion as a key strategy for well-being, organizational learning, and superior business outcomes. I'll let him talk a little bit more about himself. So without further ado, we have Jeffrey Parsons.
Thank you, Jaime. It's a great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. So why don't you tell us a little bit about you? I know you started off in finance. So what kind of led from finance into going to D&I? That's a very unique transition.
It is. And that's part of why I did it, to be quite honest, because I don't think there's enough of the background of the sort of business background that I have in DE&I at the moment. And that's probably one of the reasons why it's seen by an awful lot of people not to be working. And there is a bit of a backlash against D&I over the last year or so, as you're probably aware. And an awful lot of people who have D&I jobs no longer have those jobs because organizations have concluded that it's not working well enough to consider to be worthwhile considering staying with it, especially when budgets are tight, as there have been for many organizations in the last couple of years. It very much falls into the discretionary basket and they just walk away. And not every organization, I'm happy to say, has done that, but a lot have. And a lot of that, it comes down to the fact that in many cases, DE&I hasn't been done right, to be quite honest. I'm trying to find a polite way to put that, but D&I really does require you to put a business hat on and say, look, if you want organizations to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion, you've got to make it part of their fabric, their DNA. It's not something which you can do on what I call a transactional basis. You need to do it on a transformational basis. And that means you need to bring a business acumen to it as to how you would normally do a large project, what is effectively a change management project. This is that, and it just reaches every single part of every company. So you need to look at it in that sort of way and think it's not enough to do lots of little tactical things. I need to be much more strategic and work out where I'm going to go. It's not just lots of little individual actions which are not sewn together. What's the big picture? Where are we trying to get to? What's the transformation rather than the transaction? And coming from a business background, it's and I know what gets people's attention within organizations, and for good or ill, that tends to be dollars and cents, pounds and pence. Making sure that you've got a real business imperative, which is partly why I use the word imperative in my company name, is there and is very clear, and it's something which they can engage with. So if we do D&I right, and which means bringing this perspective to it, actually most organizations would be embracing it because they see it as valuable to their business. But quite often that hasn't been the case. And that's because a lot of people who have been doing it recently haven't really had that acumen.
A lot of organizations like to throw that term like D&I, and especially in their mission statement and their organizational values, we're very strong with D&I, but a lot of individuals don't actually know what that encompasses. In your terms, can you explain what D&I means to you and what it actually means when a company wants to adopt D&I practices?
I could talk for a long time about that, but trying to keep it brief. DE&I basically means diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they are different things. Leaving aside equity for the moment, because that's just about making sure that everyone is equal of opportunity, which is very important. But the point I really like to drill home to organizations is really to be inclusive. And that basically means to make sure that you are bringing in and empowering lots of different perspectives. People who come from different lived experiences, have got different views on life, different observations, just different ways of seeing things. And unfortunately, an awful lot of organizations marry D and I as in diversity and inclusion and see them as interchangeable. And in fact, they're very much not interchangeable. They're opposite, but they can actually work contrary to each other. And as much as diversity, if you stop at diversity, what you're really talking about there is representation, as in, do you have lots of people who represent different perspectives? Maybe it's different ethnic groups of different genders, different persuasions, different identities. Having them in the organization around the table is one thing. It's diversity. You look around the table, people look different, maybe they sound different. That's diversity. It doesn't achieve anything. In fact, it possibly achieves a net negative unless you overlay it with inclusive practices. And that means making sure that those people have a voice and they are heard and they are listened to and they're actually brought into the conversation and valued. So that's what inclusion means. It's unlocking the potential value that diversity offers. It's no good having lots of people with different experiences if you don't listen to them, you don't empower them, you don't actually use their viewpoints in the conversation. In fact, if you don't attempt to do that, all you're going to do is create a huge amount of dissonance, an awful lot of disenchanted employees who know they're not being listened to, probably a C-suite who think they've done everything they should because they've filled the room with people who look and sound different, but they're not actually doing anything different. So at the very best, they're going to tread water, but more likely they're going to go backwards because the world is going to overtake them. And you've got a room full of people who really do not know how to communicate with each other. And that's worse than having a completely homogeneous team in the room, who at least, if not, they're not going to come up with any earth-shattering ideas because they all think exactly the same way. At least they know how to talk to each other. If you just prioritize diversity without inclusion, you're setting yourself up for a big fall. And that's a problem. So why I call my business the inclusion imperative is because I consider inclusion to be an absolute imperative, rather than calling myself something related to diversity, which is super important as the groundwork towards imperative. But if you just stop at the D, then you're actually going to cause a bit of a problem, actually much more than a bit of a problem. So that's why for me, it is an imperative. It's a business imperative in the context of commercial organizations, which is the background that I come from.
Do you feel that we need to start macro level, or do you think more of a micro level with direct service workers, or do you think it has to come from the C-suite down?
It has to be both. And that's the point I was making earlier around being strategic about this, because most organizations of any size will have lots of young people in them who are expecting these workplaces now to be more inclusive or to be more embracing of different identities. One law firm that I work with at the moment said that 18% of their most recent intake identifies as LGBTQ+, which is a huge percentage and actually disproportionately probably more than representing the general population. But that's people who come with a minority characteristic are going to be expecting organizations to embrace that. So they come in with all of this wonderful grassroots energy, and they'll try to do things to the extent that, for example, a lawyer who's working 100 hours a week trying to do their articles has got energy or time to do anything. They will be trying to make things happen. So there'll be lots of energy at the coalface at the grassroots level, and employee network groups, affinity groups, etc., will be formed organically, and there'll be all sorts of, great ideas happening and people running around trying to get things done on a very episodic, tactical basis, because there's no strategic overlay. It's just lots of people saying, let's do something. You need to overlay it with some sort of strategy in order to bring that into a sort of path orientation. Where are we trying to get to with this? And it usually is, as I said, we're trying to create a more inclusive workplace, which means you need to bring in all of the people who, well, frankly, at that stage, ranked higher than those people who've just come in and have all that energy. Particularly their people managers who are going to be creating their day-to-day experience, the microculture that they're going to be living within the organization. So we need to put a strategic overlay on it to give it that sort of path orientation to where we're trying to get. And if you don't have one of those, you're going to fail. If you try to impose this, as in the C-suite just says, we're going to prioritize D&I now, and outcomes a diktat, we're going to do that, but do nothing else. They don't empower anyone to do anything about it. So there's no time allocated to it. There's insufficient budget. There's actually no rewarding of efforts in this regard. It's just going to disappear because it's just a hollow sentiment. It's not actually followed through. So one without the other doesn't really work. But in the other direction, if it happens and you've just got the grassroots energy with no strategic direction, for the reason I was saying earlier, it's not going to get anywhere because all you're going to do is an awful lot of tactical things. It'll be very transactional, very tactical, not transformational or strategic. So you need to do both. I call it grassroots with guardrails, basically. So you want that energy, but put some framework around it so that you're moving in the right direction.
In my research, I focused a lot on generational differences, Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. And one of the things that I noticed from my data was that Gen Z was more radical and they cared a lot more about DE&I or D&I versus Gen X and Gen Y. Gen Y was more impartial. Like you're like, yes, it's necessary, but it's not like a major focus of let's do this now. The same aspect with Gen X, or I see the benefit of it, but I'm not going to invest myself. I'll let the other people do it. Versus Gen Z was, I want this right now. This should have been done as of yesterday. How do we balance that want and need and get everybody to really accept it and take it more seriously?
The generational change is actually what we're dealing with here, because it's not a perfect correlation. Of course, people of a slightly older age group and people of my group, we would expect ordinarily to be more senior in organizations, and they are critical agents within the organization to make sure this either happens or at least if it's happening, that it also succeeds. It's not just quite optical. The advantage we've got now and what the Gen Zs have got is that we are not where we were 30, 40 years ago, even 10 years ago. There is a much broader understanding and appreciation of the social and moral case associated with inclusion. We're on a few years past things like Black Lives Matter, when the murder of George Floyd suddenly just opened a lot of eyes about just the social injustices and inequities out there. But also just from not a business, but it's a human rights perspective. We have things like all sorts of great legislation banning discrimination and bullying and harassment. And there's empowering legislation such as equal marriage legislation in many countries, including the UK, Canada, where I'm sitting right now. And so there's this appreciation which has given the Gen Xers this constant feeling that this is something which they should be entitled to expect. So this growth of understanding about the right thing to do, also coupled with the fact that it sits squarely under the S in the ESG, the environmental, social, and governance agenda, which is now very topical and is often the differentiator for Gen Z people in how they decide who they want to work for and what industry they want to work for, etc. This creates this huge groundswell of what is the right thing to do. What we need to do to bring the older generations in, who tend to be more established and have gone through that process, is to marry that with the best thing to do. And so I see DE&I as an intergenerational project where we are demonstrating where the right thing to do meets the best thing to do. And it's the right thing to do because of all the things we've discussed. It's absolutely an imperative and from a social and moral equity basis, but it's the best thing to do for organizations to be empowering its people, including its Gen Zs, but not just those, to make sure that when they come in, they're actually bringing the value that they bring as individuals and people with different experiences and different perspectives. And we don't just assimilate them into being a robot, basically. Make them basically so assimilated that their value is lost, their individual value is lost. I use the analogy that everyone knows, the square peg in a round hole. If you've got a square peg, it will only fit into a round hole in one of two ways. You can either reduce it in size or you can damage it. And if we're talking about Gen Xers as either being reduced as in their contribution being reduced or damaged, neither of those is particularly a successful strategy. Why would you do that? And effectively remove or downplay this massive potential of all these young people with great energy and great ideas and different perspectives on life. Very refreshing. Why would you assimilate them into absolute normality when what you really should be doing is trying to empower them? Of course, you need to have a company culture. Of course, there needs to be a degree of assimilation to make sure that the DNA of the organization stays intact. But culture is something that grows, and it should be growing organically as these inputs come into it. So it's very much about empowering the younger generation through what the slightly older generations will do in the workplace to make sure that happens.
One of the most common things that I hear when I talk to individuals is that they feel very passionate about it, but their upper management do not, and they disregard it. So is there anything that we can do at the service field at like the bottom tier where you have no real pool, let's say they have no authority, but is there anything that they can start doing to start implementing, at least at a slow process?
What they need to do is to find the space to demonstrate value. And that means that that's why you need to be more strategic rather than tactical. So there's a great temptation if you are one of the younger people within a firm. For example, you may have got involved in the employee network group, the employee resource group, whatever it's called. And there's a great temptation to just run around doing an awful lot of things, which I've fallen victim to that myself, because you always want to be seen to be doing something because you're really pushing awareness. And awareness is the most basic thing. You want everyone to be aware of this issue. And that's all very well, but you need to go beyond that. That's where you need to be strategic and say, what is the purpose of this beyond just making sure that everyone knows that we exist and that there are people like us in the workplace and we have certain needs. What we need to do is make sure that's seen as a two-way street. Yes, we would like people to be nice to us because we're a minority and we do want to feel included, but what's the payback if you do that? Is it just, let's be nice to the gays, or let's be nice to the women, or let's be nice to the people of color? No, it's actually, it's very much a two-way street. It's a bargain. Basically, if you empower those people by being inclusive of them, this is the payback you get. And that's what people should be demonstrating more, is that be a bit more strategic about what you're doing and say, look, if you put these inputs in, then this is the payback you're going to get. Now, there's not a direct correlation. If I spend $1 on doing this, then suddenly I'm going to get $1.50 of profits. It doesn't happen that way. It's about changing culture. It's about changing behavioral practices. And you have to have a long-term view about it. But there are endless studies out there which can be packaged into all sorts of forms, which would be quite persuasive if demonstrated in the proper fashion to, say, senior management. I could quote thousands of them to you. I'm not going to bore you with doing that, but there is one that I always like to quote, which was some research from Deloitte back in 2016. And they just focused on two key things that inclusion brings, and it's upside and downside. And they basically said an inclusively managed workplace environment creates a 20% pickup in innovation and a 30% increase in risk awareness. And that means you've got the upside and you've got the downside covered. And I always say, it's no good just saying, let's all just be creative and stuff like that and not always worry about the upside. You've also got the downside covered because people are more aware of risks and are willing to share perspectives and air their concerns. There won't be another incident like what happened in the late 1980s when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded purely because people were shouted down and their minority perspective was not listened to. It was basically considered to be just stop, go away, we've got to do this. Crowding people out like that basically means you're only going to be looking at one part of the direction. You want to do both. And if you can demonstrate to upper management through strategically the sort of things you want to be doing, rather than just say, we'll have a party. Parties are good because you want to feel included, but you need to do more strategic things as well. Then there are going to be plenty more people who will listen because it's ultimately a compelling business case. And eventually there will be more of a herd mentality as more organizations embrace it. And a lot of very big organizations are really running with this now. Like Google has been running Project Aristotle for several years now, which is all really about the value of inclusion and what's the key dynamics for team success. Once that becomes so ingrained, the other big organizations are going to follow suit. And that means that there will be a much more accepted groundswell of best practices. But it is, you've got to play the long game with this. It's not going to be a sort of, if I do this, then that. It's not as quick a causality as that, unfortunately. But if you pursue this and you demonstrate that pathway, that direction to senior management, at least some of them won't come on board. We won't get everyone, but hopefully we can get enough.
What you said is key. It takes time. This is something that it's like you take one class or you do one training and all of a sudden it's magically fixed. It is a culture shift. It is an organizational structure that you're going to have to input. And you may try some things that may work, and then you may try some things that may not work. You're going to have to try a lot of different things until you implement, really ingrained it into your organization.
Yeah, you need to take the long view with it for sure. And that can be very difficult in many an industry where most people are measured on a short-term basis. How have you done this quarter? I'm with a background in financial services. I wasn't in the type of industry that was that short-term oriented, a part of the industry, but an awful lot of it is. And certainly you're never really looking much beyond the next 6 months to a year. And that does run contrary to the need to take a long-term perspective on something which is very much a culture change management. And culture is this big lumbering thing that you don't just change overnight. It's like turning the Titanic, is the analogy that I always use. It's slow and it's heavy and it's difficult to do, but you better turn it. Otherwise there's an iceberg ahead. You know what I mean? At some point you are going to hit an iceberg. So turn it while you can. It might be slow, but start turning now and you might avoid that iceberg. So please make sure that you take the long-term view. And that speaks to exactly what I was saying. If you think transactionally all the time, all you're going to do is tinker around the edges. You need to be thinking transformationally rather than transactionally. Make sure you're looking at strategy, not just tactics.
Yes, and we talked a lot about the benefits of having DE&I inside an organization. My research primarily was focused on employee retention and turnover. So mine was more the bad side, and the D&I always consistently came in here, and it's important for us to talk about also what happens if we choose not to include it.
Mhm.
Microaggressions start growing, comments due to ignorance, or there's a big difference between acceptance and tolerance. And staff can feel that if their supervisors and peers tolerate them versus accept them. And all of these can do big impact into the employee that also feel into the clientele. So it just really creates a very hostile and toxic work environment.
Exactly, and particularly youngsters who've got ambitions to formulate a career at this stage, that they got more influence in that and much more information at their disposal now than any generation in the past has ever had. And they will ultimately vote with their feet. You've rightly said tolerance is not good enough. You need acceptance. Actually, we need to go beyond acceptance. We need to go one stage further, which is celebration. And that's where the magic happens. If you're just if you're just accepting someone, you're not actually necessarily honoring their viewpoint. You're just like letting it exist. And that's the point I was talking about earlier. What inclusion relies upon is the celebration of difference, bringing in different perspectives and thinking differently about thinking differently. If somebody else thinks differently than you, and that unnatural unconscious bias from back when we were living in caves and hunting for dinner on a daily basis, formulated hardwired into our brains, basically says that no, I want to go back to people who like me. I'm tribal. So affinity bias will come steaming into the room and crowd out every single thing else. But that's one of the things that the most important thing unconscious bias training should do, more often than doesn't do. It should actually just make you aware of those things, stop you feeling like you're a bad person if you have biases, because we all do, and just make you aware that you can counteract the effect of them by practicing conscious inclusion. And that basically means if you do that, then you are going to be able to embrace people who've got different viewpoints, and you can celebrate their difference as opposed to just tolerating it or even accepting it. I don't think accepting it's going to cut it, to be honest. It sounds nice. We all get on, don't we? But if we're not listening to each other and empowering each other to bring that difference in, then actually that's not going to add any value. It's just going to let things just carry on sort of BAU. But where's the extra juice coming from? That's missing the trick.
I've never really thought about that. You hear it. We're taught that tolerance is an acceptance, but I've never heard the next stage, which is celebrate. And it completely makes sense because it's like when we come out, like ourselves, okay, this is me. I'm curious about the idea, then you tolerate it, and then you accept it. And then after a while, you are proud for who you are and why we have pride and why we have all these events to really show people that we have no embarrassment for we are in our identity, and we do celebrate it. So why not do that in more micro level forms with our coworkers, with our peers, and show them that we do care about them and their differences, and how because of their difference, it makes our workplace a lot better.
Yeah, no, exactly. It is the secret sauce, to be honest, of success. And that's why I effectively preach to organizations all the time, is that it's not something you can be passive about. You actually have to actively create an inclusive environment to want to hear what other people have got to say and go about trying to find what I call constructive conflicts. The last thing we want is to have everybody harmoniously getting on with each other. Actually, you want people to be challenging each other. I talk to organizations about the importance of psychological safety a lot. And there's a common misinterpretation of what a psychologically safe environment is, that it is harmonious. And actually, it's probably the most boisterous, noisy place you can imagine, because everybody feels empowered to contribute without fear of retribution. And if you've got that situation, then it's going to be noisy, and there's going to be conflict there, but it is the conflict that you want. It's constructive conflict. What Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, used to call creative destruction. It's break it down and make it better. Going to the gym, you break your muscles to make them bigger. You want that sort of conflict to create the magic that the different perspectives bring. You don't want dissonance, you want value coming out of it. And it means that there's an awful lot of work to do in terms of managers, not only in creating this environment where people feel empowered, but also in managing it, because you can imagine all of the noise that's happening, and you've got to cut through that to find a pathway that you all agree upon. What I always say is the perfect team is unified, but not uniform. That's a very important distinction. Yeah. Whatever the end result is, after a lot of discussion, people throwing their hats into the ring, you've got to decide what the action is. And that's got to be a consensus. And it will therefore not be exactly what everybody wanted to do, but they need to get behind it and they need to be unified behind that. And that's good team management, conflict resolution, change management in progress, where you really get everybody to buy into the vision that has come from everybody having their say. And that means that lots of people won't get their way, but they will get in line and row the boat in the same direction as they want to. They'll have different roles within that boat, what they're meant to be doing, but they're all going in the same direction and in sync. And that's really important.
Unified, but not uniform. And there's multiple ways of getting a solution done. Like there's multiple ways of, yes, you need to learn the fundamentals. We all need to start at a baseline of like how to do things and how to function so that we don't fail. But try different methods, try different things that your way may be significantly better for you versus not so good for someone else. So just try different methodologies. That's beautifully said.
It's actually a perfect point you make, because there is no one size fits all. We're human beings. We're organic. Everybody's different. And that's the skill set that leaders, and particularly people leaders, the ones who are creating the microcultures within a workplace environment, they need to be practicing what I call empathetic leadership, basically. That's the reason I call myself, as CEO, I call myself Chief Empathy Officer, is because the process of practicing empathetic leadership and being compassionate, which is the more action-oriented sibling, if you like, of empathy, is absolutely critical. People are not the same. You've got to, if you want to empower people to be part of the conversation meaningfully, you've got to meet them where they're at. And that means you've got to get to know them in a way which probably exceeds anything that most bosses in the past ever wanted to do. They wanted to keep that sort of boss to team distinction, and near the twain shall meet. Well, it has to. You don't have to be best buddies. You don't have to hang out at the weekend and stuff like that, but find out what makes your people tick. It's meet them where they're at. Find out how they want to be treated. So the phrase we always hear, treat other people like you would like to be treated yourself. Actually, treat other people like they would like to be treated themselves. That's much more important. And you need to find that out, because people are different and people will behave differently at work. Some people are extroverts, some people are introverts, some people have learning challenges. People learn in different ways. Some people learn sitting in a classroom. Other people learn by reading a book or researching something on the internet or doing something practical. Some people will always speak up in a meeting. Other people will feel a bit shy, even if they've got a lot to say, they wouldn't want to. So you've got to know how to empower people in different ways. If you put the same one size fits all model on everything, you're going to miss an awful lot of potential value. And that's where equity comes in, right? So equity is adjusting for those differences, making reasonable adjustments, as the terminology would say when talking about disability, for example. Make reasonable adjustments with your staff. It's what I call psychological ergonomics. Because, I remember sitting at my desks many times in jobs, and the companies I worked for spent a lot of time and money to make sure that, ergonomically I was okay physically, as in my screen was the right height and my chair was okay and all that, and I wasn't, get injured. And I was very appreciative of that, because I do have a rubbish back and all that stuff. But it's occurred to me that nobody's doing that between years as to what you're like as a person. So there should be just as much emphasis on psychological ergonomics as there is on physical ergonomics, and making the reasonable adjustments that implies for people within your team so that they do have a voice, and you're not trying to impose a one size fits all model on something that just would not fit with that.
You would be amazed how quickly you can get the answer to these questions if you just ask. A lot of us don't want to have those uncomfortable conversations with our staff, because it is uncomfortable, because it's not, you're becoming vulnerable. They have to be vulnerable, and they may ask something that you may not be able to 100% having your power to give. And you have to be willing to listen and see, how can we maneuver so that I can advocate for you? So maybe that can be an accommodation or something that we implement, and be very open-minded, because what may seem like a bad idea to you may be a phenomenal idea for the organization.
Exactly. And that is, you want those opposing viewpoints, you want those challenges. Even if you don't agree with them, and even if ultimately you don't end up pursuing them, at least consider them, give them airspace, give them airtime. And that, for me, that's the essence of empathetic leadership. It's about empowering people around you. And the old model of being the leader who had to set themselves up as some fabulous oracle of all knowledge and was infallible and may as well put a cape on because they're clearly some superpower hero from the realms of some gods or something. That no one was ever like that. And in fact, most bosses just got promoted through longevity, through the Peter principle. And some of them were just, frankly, just not with zero people skills at all. Even assuming they've got people skills, what we need to do is overlay those skills with a purpose, which basically brings the most out of the team that works with them. So surround yourself with people who will challenge you, create the psychologically safe environment where people feel that they can do that, and make sure you don't impose your view on your staff in a way which basically means that they won't say anything. Don't do what this sort of crowding. Don't walk into a meeting and say, here's what we should do. Simon Sinek it was who wrote a book called Leaders Eat Last. What he meant was leaders speak last. Give the space, give the airtime to your staff. Do not shape their opinions. Let them shape yours. You'll have your own opinions as well, but let them contribute to yours, shall we say, rather than shape yours. It's super important. And being an empathetic leader, it means admitting that you don't know everything. In fact, nor should you know everything. If you did, then why bother having anyone else work for you? You should just have soldiers. You want people to be adding value to this. So you've got to empower them. So that partly means admitting that you're not infallible, embracing that vulnerability, role modeling that so that when people make mistakes in your team, because they will, and you want them to make mistakes because you want them to be experimenting and trying to innovate. And that means you will inevitably make mistakes. And from those mistakes, you will learn. And that's how we will all grow. Role modeling the fact that you are fallible will empower them to do the same. And this is fairly obvious when you think about it, but setting yourself up as somebody who never makes a mistake is some sort of authoritarian god is just not the way to succeed. We want leaders to be more like what it was Greg McKeown and Liz Wiseman called multipliers. We want them to basically be creating multiple benefits from their staff, like boosting up the value of their staff. The opposite of being an authoritarian leader, which basically an authoritarian leader is Peter Drucker, who noted they never get the best out of their staff because no staff will do anything discretionary in that regard. They will just do what you're told. You're in the mode of, I need to be seen to be doing what you want me to do, but no more or no less, because that's risky. So why would I do that? So if you want to boost your staff to go above and beyond, you need to empower them to do that by giving them the freedom to fail forward effectively, to trip, fall, get up, learn, and then learn how not to trip the next time.
Exactly. And the only way to do that is to foster a good environment to make them feel comfortable to do that and allowing them to have access to resources so that they can make these attempts and really try to grow. And just like we did as leaders, we tried, failed, and then learned. We have to give them the same opportunities and then I see a lot of organizations still stick with the whole, if you make this many mistakes, you're fired.
Yep.
And it's such an antiquated model. And I get it. It's revenue based. We want to produce results. However, you're creating a culture of turnover, of hostility, and you limit creativity because then people are scared to try new things and potentially methods that can actually improve the process and actually increase your revenue because you limited the resources and you limited what they could or could not try. So just be forgiving. And we need to, I mentioned this to other directors that I work with and other supervisors. We need to start learning how to coach your staff to evolve them and create another you, or create another form of leader so that if something were to happen to you, get promoted, we don't pigeonhole people in their positions, but actually allow them to move and grow within the organization.
And we want them to be challenging themselves. Actually, we want people to be comfortable with being slightly uncomfortable, as in always feeling stretched. This thing called imposter syndrome, which everyone seems, oh my God, I feel terrified about it. Actually, in most cases, not in all cases, but in the vast majority of cases, imposter syndrome is just that slight feeling of being outside your comfort zone, which means you're being stretched. It means you are progressing, and it means you will make mistakes and you will fail, and that means you'll learn from them. But as long as you're given the space to do that, then you shouldn't be punished for making mistakes in that regard. Sure, if you're constantly making mistakes of the same type of thing, which you really should have been in your comfort zone, then maybe you're just in the wrong job. But let's be honest, most of the cases, that's not what happens. People are given responsibility and not coached through it well enough, and they make mistakes and are seen as perceived negatively when actually what the problem was the system. So firing someone or in any way punishing that person, then it's actually tinkering with the symptom rather than the cause. What you're saying is the symptom is something went wrong because this person did something wrong. The actual cause is the system, as in the lack of coaching, or basically there might be any number of reasons why that person was not performing optimally. Assuming that they're technically qualified and your recruitment system actually behaved the way it should have done, and that person is in the right role and are equipped to do what we want them to do. If they make mistakes, it's probably because of something that you did or didn't do, or a particular circumstance that they are in that you are not aware of and not taking account of. So, for example, it might be something to do with they're under an awful lot of stress personally, or they've got something going on in their life that you aren't aware of. And why aren't you aware of that? Because you're not being empathetic. You're not allowing yourself to get to know them. You're not allowing them to be open enough with you because you're not being open enough with them. You'll hear managers all the time say, and I say managers rather than leaders deliberately in this case, because a leader should not say this, my door is always open. And as if that were the sort of magic solution for everything. And it's a wonderfully passive phrase where this is my territory. And if you step over the barrier into my little kingdom / queendom, whatever it is, I'm letting you in, but it's a concession, right? And you're basically invading my space. And yeah, it's okay. It's a real power imbalance. And it however well-intended that phrase is, I actually think it's quite passive aggressive. And I do think leaders need to be much more proactive in the way they go about trying to imbue confidence in their staff, so that those staff will be able to say, look, actually, I've really got a problem with this deadline because X, Y, and Z. And rather than muck it up, actually have that conversation up front so you can deal with these things. Otherwise, you are just going to be ending up possibly losing really good staff, really good resources, because the system failed them. And therefore, ultimately, the system is going to be suffering the consequences of that because it won't have those great resources in it.
Completely agree. It's really hard to fall into that trap of trying to say what you want, but not do what you want to do. So if you're going to say my office is always open, I have an open door policy, instead of just saying that, add action to it. So go in and sit down with your employees and and do that reflective supervision, do a little bit of motivational interviewing, like professional development, and get to know them, build rapport, and actually see where are the bottlenecks in your personal performance and how can I help you grow and prosper. And let's really find out what issues there is. Don't wait for the issues to come to you, because half of the time the staff don't even know the issues that they're having. If you don't point out what's going on, then they don't know something's going on. So you have to be more involved than the historical supervisor or manager.
Yeah. If you're a people leader, which an awful lot of people are, as I say, an awful lot of them are in that position through the benefit of legacy of being good at the job they did before and just get promoted as a result of that, probably without an awful lot of training or awareness. So it's going to be nothing more than a happy coincidence if they happen to be good at this job as well, because it might have people management responsibilities that they never had. They've got a very tough job and we need to support them to do it. So it sounds like we're basically asking people managers to do a ton of things, and we are. And that basically means we need to do an awful lot of things to help them as well. We need to give them the tools, the training, the resources, the time. And this is back to the point about it being strategic, right? The whole thing. Another reason why these things tend not to succeed is it's very lumpy within organizations. You'll get great messages from the C-suite, and yet there won't be any time given or resources given to the people who are a couple of rungs down in the organization, who will need those resources to make it happen. So, for example, like a manager has a vacancy they need to fill, and they know there's a candidate that out there would be from a diversity and inclusion perspective, as in a potentially new, really interesting resource that would be of great value in the long run. That's one option, and they'd be great value in maybe 6 months' time. But you've got another one could do the job now, but will do exactly the same job, but probably add no further value. And in almost all cases, they'll be forced to take that person just because they've got an immediate deliverable and they're going to be judged on that in the short term. So if the people above the people we're asking to be very inclusive, which tends to be the people managers, are not giving them the resources, the space, the tools, the bandwidth to deliver on that, it's never going to work. So this has to be a really joined up thinking process. And this is partly why it fails, because you'll see tons of initiatives in organizations who do DE&I and they go away and do one little isolated one-off training for a cohort, say people managers, who maybe get some unconscious bias training or something to do with inclusive leadership or what have you. and they go back to their desk and their world hasn't changed. No one is going to say to them, okay, fine, now I'm going to give you extra resources to do this. It's basically fit that around a bunch of other massively urgent deliverables that I'm still going to be wanting from you. And so they're set up for failure. And eventually, through no fault of their own, it will get crowded out because they're not going to be judged on that, because that's a long-term gain. They're going to be judged on getting the project done now and blah, blah, blah. So you can't blame them. And I do think it's very unfair that they get it all ends up, really. The people managers are in a horrible position, but they are the critical people that we need to talk to. And we need to do that in a way which brings in the other stakeholders, which are key to them being able to do what we need them to do.
Completely agree. And I can talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity for hours, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask you the last question, which is the whole premise of the podcast, which is unicorns. So if somebody wants to be more inclusive and implement DE&I, but what are some things that they can do to take the first steps to become a DE&I unicorn in their organization, in their personal life, and really takes the steps to actually implement it? Like you said, it doesn't just fade away, but actually becomes more permanent.
Yeah. As I said, if you can, just try to think backwards from where you want to be. Always try to think strategically. What am I trying to achieve with this? And for some people, it's really just about, if you're in an organization, for example, and you are of a minority, particularly if you're in a minority which isn't visible, so not gender-based or ethnicity-based, it's maybe disability, or it might even be age-related, or certainly LGBTQ+. And that requires you to make a choice as to whether or not that's something you bring into the workplace with you. And for some people, in that case, what they're really just after is the feeling of not being alone, the safe space. And if that's all that you want, and from that, then absolutely fine. And I get that. If you want to do more than that, and you want to basically try to make sure that it's not just safe for you, but it's safer for everyone, and safe not just in not being dangerous, but safe for them to be valuable contributors rather than just passengers on the bus that the organization is, then you'll need to get more involved with that. And that basically just means you've got to get into a more strategic way of thinking. Now, I'm relatively fortunate in as much as I co-founded and chaired the LGBTQ plus employee resource groups at my last two jobs. And that, of course, for about 12, 13 years, by which time I was already relatively senior. So I was already in my 40s, scarily. And that isn't the case for an awful lot of people. And when they come in, it's the youngsters who are trying to do all of this. And that means thinking strategically is harder in as much as they haven't really got that strategic perspective yet, because they don't know the organization or the industry well enough. They just haven't been involved for that long. So it's something which accumulates over time. And one of the things I have observed a lot, and again, part of it might be a symptom, but I do think it's more cause than symptom of why there's been a bit of a backlash against D&I, is after what happened with George Floyd, and in the UK, the introduction of gender pay gap reporting, there was a bit of a knee-jerk panic by an awful lot of organizations to be seen to be doing something. It's what I call optical inclusion rather than optical illusion. And basically rush out and appoint someone as the head. And an awful lot of people were put into positions which they were fundamentally not qualified to do, because they were too young and they didn't have the gravitas, and maybe they looked right, as in they had a couple of visible characteristics, which, back to the point about representation that I was saying earlier, rather than actually, were they actually going to be empowered to do something? And these poor people were set up for failure, of course, because they weren't able to achieve anything. And that's part of the problem, is you do need to have a bit of a strategic mindset. You need to have a little bit of gravitas. You need to be able to get things done. And that tends to mean that it needs to be a little bit older. So you need to be patient. If you are somebody coming into an organization in your 20s, get involved, do what you can, get yourself known, get your voice heard, but appreciate that you're probably not going to be able to change the world on your own until you're a bit later. Hopefully, you're part of a machine which is already changing the world. So you've got somebody a bit older who's able to think that bit more strategically, and you can help them with your perspective coming in and helping that happen. But bear in mind that you've got to take the long game on this. So make sure that you always, stay true to yourself. Make sure that you're always making sure that your employer, the people around you, know that this matters to you. It's not just a nice to have. This is an important ingredient in the workspace for you. And these are the reasons, and this is why it matters to you, but why it should matter to them as well. So make sure you're always preaching the right song. That's the wrong phrase, preaching the right sermon. Then do as much as you can day to day, do the work, except that there will be times when you can't do this because you'll be just, it'll get crowded up by other massive deliverables. You're going to be working 100 hours a week or doing exams or whatever it is. And you don't have to do it every single day of the year, but do it when you can and take the time to listen and learn and go and constantly be curious about other people's experiences so that you're not just coming at it from the angle of your personal vested interest. I don't just think about what it's like to be gay in the workplace. I understand what it's like to be a minority in the workplace because I do try to think intersectionally and learn about what it's like for other people of minority characteristics. So always try to think a little bit more outside your comfort zone in that sense as well. And you'll be much more well equipped for when you are able to step into a slightly more change agent type role to actually do it in a way which doesn't look like you're just looking after your own vested interest.
I love that. And that's really great advice. And you gave a lot of wonderful nuggets today in this conversation. So listeners, if you missed anything, make sure you rewind it, listen, and really take notes. But if they do have questions, let's say somebody wants to know a little bit more about DE&I, how can they get in contact with you and then maybe even get your agency involved with theirs?
I would be delighted to have conversations with anyone who's interested in trying to make the world and their organization more inclusive. So please do reach out to me. The easiest way to reach me is via my website, which is just theinclusionimperative.com. So there's a contact page there you can reach me through and that will come through to my email. Or you can find me on LinkedIn where I'm very active and you'll have to find me with the horrible spelling of my name, Geffrye, which is pretty unique and causes a lot of people to think that I'm just joking. No, that is how I spell Geffrye, or rather how my father spelt it. Make sure you type that right into LinkedIn to find me and then contact me there and you'll see me very presently. I'd really welcome any discussions for people who are keen to know how to do DE&I and specifically how to do it strategically and do it better so that we actually do make a difference rather than fall into things like optical inclusion and be seen to be doing stuff performatively or tokenistically. I really want people to be taking this seriously. I'd love to help them do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Geffrye. And for listeners, if you want to learn more about Geffrye, he will be showing up on Unicorn Wall of Fame on my website at raygoza-consulting.com, where you'll see a blog and be able to read pretty much a summation of this episode along with any social media links that he provided and his website. You can also scroll down on the show notes on this episode to find those there as well. Quick reminders for everyone. Episodes come out every Friday at 7 a.m. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. Geffrye, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And until next time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Finding the Unicorn in You podcast. I truly appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode and gained valuable insights. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review on your favorite platform. Keep listening, keep learning, and keep growing. Until next time, this is Dr. Jaime G. Raygoza signing off.